Hi, thanks very much. Thank you to the organisers, to Brandon and Brendan for inviting me. I'm really sorry I can't be there, but things didn't work out. And it's really strange. I'm never nervous giving talks, but I'm nervous giving this one because I can't see you. Although I can see you on the live stream, but it's 10 minutes ago. So I'm going to be talking about transforming the self through immersive virtual reality. So virtual reality is typically used to transform where we are. So you're in your lab, or these days in your living room, you put on a head-mounted display and suddenly you're in the Himalayas, or like what Brandon said before. Oh, Brendan, sorry, I'm confused between the two names. You put on the head-mounted display and you're suddenly on top of a building. So virtual reality is usually used to transform where we are. But here I'm going to provide evidence that it can be used to transform ourselves, to transform to some extent who we are. And I'm going to give evidence from two studies, one on sexual harassment and one on conversations with yourself. And then I'm going to show some current work that we're doing very briefly, and then some conclusions. So body ownership illusion, the way we do it is this way. You're in the virtual reality. You look down, instead of seeing your real body, you see a virtual body that visually substitutes it, that's life-size. As you move, your virtual body moves the same, and you see it in a mirror. And typically, from first-person perspective, and typically, after a few seconds of this stimulation, most people will have the strong illusion, not with the belief, of course, but the illusion that this is their body. And the only way you can shut off this illusion, like many illusions, is by closing your eyes. But while your eyes are open, you have the strong feeling that this is your body. So this is another way to do it. I think that this was shown in the very first talk, a part of this. So here we both have visual motor synchrony. As you move, the body moves with you, and also visual tactile synchrony. When the balls strike you, you feel it. And of course, first person perspective. And this, again, it gives a very strong illusion of this is your body. Now, body ownership illusions in virtual reality go right back to the early days of the late 1980s, when Jaron Lanier embodied himself as a lobster and moved the lobster body by muscle movements. All this quirk was basically unpublished, but he's talked about it in his most recent book. Then in the mid-2007, Bailenson and Yi introduced the Proteus effect, which is concerned with how the type of body and then a very important event happened in 1998, which was a one-page paper in Nature by Botnovic and Cohen, who showed that with the appropriate multisensory stimulation, you can get the illusion that a rubber hand that's being tapped the same time as your own hand, but you can't see your own hand, but you see a rubber hand in place of it, that rubber hand can become part of your body, that you have the illusion of ownership over that. We reproduced that in immersive virtual reality in 2008. And then in 2010, we introduced the first whole body ownership illusion in virtual reality, basically using the ideas of Botnovic and Cohen, plus visual motor stimulation. So these body ownership illusions in virtual reality, they go back a long time. I'm not going to go into it, but there's many, many publications that show that basically this illusion works. The ownership of a whole body or a part of a body, this is well established. What's more interesting is the correlates of this altered body. So several examples have shown that when you change the body, because the body can be anything, I mean, a human body, but a man can be embodied as a woman or vice versa, different race, different age, and so on. When you change the body, to some extent, you also change the mind. So examples that we've been involved in are racial bias. When you take a white person and you put them in a black virtual body, typically their implicit racial bias will decrease, and that decrease stays over a while. You can take adults and put them in the body of a child, and we've applied this with parenting. When your virtual body does something that you didn't do, you can have the illusion of agency over that. So your virtual body does something, you yourself don't do it, but still you have the illusion that you did it. You can use it for changing people's motor activity. It's been used for pain reduction, cognitive changes. If you embody people with low self-esteem in the body of Einstein, they actually do better on a cognitive test. And earlier, the fear of death was talked about in the very first talk. So there's several publications on this. Basic message is change the body, you change the mind. So I'm going to go on to my two examples now. And the first one is on sexual harassment. I'm sure everybody in the audience knows the seriousness of this. Like, I looked at a US Equal Employment Opportunities Commission report, and it says that 45% of harassment claims are sex-based, at least 25% of women experience it in the workplace, 75% of harassment victims experience retaliation when they reported it, between 87 and 94% the employees experiencing harassment don't file a formal complaint, and sexual harassment costs companies millions apart from the that it causes. So the idea that we had, and this was actually funded by the Office of Naval Research, we didn't, in the US, we didn't want to work on anything military, but we worked on the problem that they were interested in, which is that people were often engaged in behaviors in a group that they wouldn't do otherwise. They wouldn't do themselves because they consider it wrong, but in a group they would do it. So instead of using a military context, we use sexual harassment of women by a group of men. And now was where the later behavior after a certain experience would be changed depending on the experience that they had. And let me explain that a bit more. So the scenario is that there's a group of men in a bar talking together. There's a lone woman sitting at a nearby table. Then one of the men insists that she joins them, and she refuses. The men become more and more insistent. So this is the scenario. First of all, the subject is embodied in the person, in the man in the bottom right-hand corner in the reddish shirt. If he looks down, he sees his virtual body. If he moves, he sees reflections also in the window. And you see the lone woman sitting there on the towards the top left-hand side. And the men talk to him, and then they start harassing that woman. And then there's a further round where the next time the subject, the participant in the experiment, is either embodied as one of the other men and relives the whole scenario, or is embodied as the woman and relives the whole scenario. So here's a more detail about the experiment. There were 3 conditions, 20 people in each group. In what I'm calling the woman condition, they first experience the scenario as one of the men, and then they relive the whole thing again, embodied as the woman. Another group, which I call the group condition, 20 men experienced it, 20 men experienced it as another member of the group. And then they re-experienced it again as, they first experienced it as the one man, and then they re-experienced it again as another member of the group, another man. And then there was a control group, 20 men experienced the bar, but nothing happened. There was no sexual harassment, nothing happened at all. Now, the important point is, instead of measuring something immediately, we waited 1 week, and they all came back and they did a virtual Milgram obedience scenario. I think probably most of you know about Stanley Milgram studies of obedience in the 1960s and 70s. Basically, it's a scenario where you're asked to give electric shocks to a stranger when they get answers to some questions wrong. And the question Milgram has would, how much shock would people give the stranger just at the behest of the experimenter? In our one, they were asked to give electric shocks to a female subject, of course, a virtual character, as part of a memory study. We followed Milgram's scenario. After a while, she started vociferously complaining about the shots because they would be painful, and they were asked to be let out. And she asked to be let out. 3 virtual male characters encouraged the participant to continue whenever they faltered. Our question was, how many shocks did they administer out of a maximum of 20? And did that depend on which condition they were in the bar experiment the week before? So here's a bit more about Milgram.
The teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me
me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go in. Let me out.
Refuse to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
So as people are asked to give shocks up to 400 volts to strangers, of course it was an actor in the name of science, Milgram's question was, what percentage of people would administer even 400 volts? And the answer was very shocking. It was actually 60% of people in this condition. Milgram ran many different versions of this condition. In this one, the subject did not see the one who they were giving shocks to, except beforehand. In another version, the one that we replicated, they did actually see the ones they were giving shock to. So here's a video which explains our study. I'll wind it forward a bit. So here what's happening is the subject is just being embodied, and then a conversation starts.
Hombre, Marc, ¿cómo estás?
They're just talking everyday chat.
Un poco de estrés, ya te puedes
He's a bit
imaginar.
stressed.
Ya, es lo que nos toca. Yo llevo una temporada sin parar también. ¿Y tú, cómo te llamas?
How are you?
¿Qué
He
coño
talks
haces?
to the participant.
Ah, qué chica hay ahí. ¿Nos parece que está buena?
They're now talking about the woman
Ahora sí
on
que
the
te
other
estás
side.
preocupando de lo importante. Pues sí, sí que está buena, sí.
She's saying she looks very nice.
Hola, guapa.
Calls her
¿Cómo te
over.
llamas?
Hello, beauty.
Oye, solo quiero saber tu nombre. Mira, estaba aquí triste, pero te he mirado.
She
y me
looks a
has
bit
salido
sad.
Eres muy guapo. Mira,
Very
un besito.
beautiful.
No te cuesta nada. Un beso.
He called her over for a kiss.
En serio, ¿no tenéis nada mejor que hacer?
She says, leave me alone. Haven't you got anything better to do?
¿Pero qué te piensas? ¿Qué te crees? ¿Que no te he visto? No paras de morderte el labio, tocarte las piernas. Y no digas que no. Después no quieres tomar ni un trago con nosotros. Vaya, te gusta vacilar a los tíos. En serio, es que intento entender a las mujeres y que es imposible.
The women are
No hay
impossible.
nada que entender. Todas son iguales.
They're all
Ya
the
verás
same.
cómo al final viene. Deja, ahora voy y te la
He's going to
traigo.
bring her over. Now we move to the second condition. This is a subject who the second time round was another member of the group, the one on the far left-hand side. This is just the embodiment period,
Mira, qué chica.
and then
eres.
everything is replayed as it was before.
Ah, ahora sí que te
Whatever
estás
the
preocupando
subject
de lo
himself
importante. Pues
did
sí, sí que está
is
bueno. Hola, guapa. ¿Cómo te llamas?
And now we move to the next condition, which is the woman condition. They're embodied as the woman.
Entonces, mira hacia abajo.
This is the embodiment
mano
period.
derecha, ok, muy bien. Mira hacia abajo, hacia tu cuerpo. Eso, ok.
I didn't
Ahora
choose this
mira
model, by the
hacia
way.
tu izquierda. Ok, levanta la mano. Saluda hacia el espejo. Ok, muy bien. La
Un
mano.
besito. No te cuesta nada. Un beso.
Now he just relives the whole thing
¿No
over
tenéis nada
again.
mejor que hacer?
Qué fuerte.
The movements are his own, but the voice is generated.
Ya deberían llevar un manual de instrucciones o algo. A ver, es que no hay quien las entienda. Esta se cree superior a nosotros. Solo por hablarle, por decirle guapa. Es que la molestamos. ¿Pero qué te piensas? ¿Qué te crees? ¿Que no te he visto? No paras de morderte el labio, tocarte la...
And so it goes on. I'll wind it forward a bit.
Deja, ahora voy y te la
And
traigo.
he's going to bring her over, he says. And then it ends. So 1 week later, they then had this Milgram scenario.
Los efectos de la valoración positiva y
So the
negativa.
experimenters explaining to the subject
En este caso, la valoración negativa
How
corresponde
to
a un castigo por cada error.
respond. And then it's like the Milgram one.
Azul, verde, amarilla, negro.
¿Verde?
Correcto. Carretera, avenida, calle, carril, camino.
Avenida.
No, incorrecto.
¡Ah!
Plátano,
And so it goes on. And it gets worse and worse.
¡Ah! ¡Dejadme salir!
Let me go out.
Va, no le hagas caso. Ella también acepta
The
nuestras
experimenter
condiciones.
starts saying she agreed to the conditions. She's not going to be let out, and so on. Of course, the subject can stop at any time they want.
marrón.
So what happened? So remember, we were counting how many shocks did they give, and the maximum was 20. So as you can see here, this is a histogram of the frequency of shocks. Those in the group condition, that is, those who the second time round were embodied as another man, the majority gave all 20 shocks. When we look at those embodied at the woman condition, the situation's quite different. More than half of them get stopped as soon as the woman started complaining, which is around shock 9. Of course, there's a bifurcation that some still did carry on to the end, but it's quite different pattern to the first one. Those in the control condition, that is, they didn't experience anything in the bar, nothing happened. This is kind of like halfway between, like an average interpolation of the first two. So I did a Bayesian analysis of this result, and the horizontal axis is the probability of giving low shocks. So those in the woman condition, the probability is highest that they give low shocks. The dashed line, those in the group condition, the probability is highest that they give high shocks. And those in the control condition, it's like an interpolation of the first two. So re-embodiment as the woman or as the member of the group each had a strong effect. Being re-embodied as the woman led to a greater probability of stopping the shocks as soon as the woman started complaining. Being in the group led to a greater tendency to give shocks than the control group. And this is just recently being submitted as a publication. And the argument I'm putting forward is that basically there was a breakdown of the group pressure had they been embodied as in the woman, because they saw the group from a completely different point of view. Many of the participants were saying things like, I thought they were idiots and stuff like that after they'd been embodied in the woman condition. So embodiment in a scenario experience from different perspectives is a powerful implicit learning technique. We don't tell the participants what they're supposed to think, they just have the experience. So it can be a powerful way to reduce violent behavior or harassment with many possible applications. Now I'm going to move on to a more sophisticated version of the same idea of swapping bodies. You've seen a small example of this in the first talk this morning. And the basic idea of this is that we're typically much better at giving advice to a friend than to ourselves. And probably most of us, including myself, we talk to ourselves almost continuously on the inside all the time. But when we do it, when we talk to ourselves, we somehow don't reach a resolution or a good resolution because we only see it from our own point of view. Now, suppose you could objectify the you that you talk with when you talk with yourself. Maybe talking with yourself as if with another person would be helpful for personal problem solving. So we did a first experiment on this in 2015, which is published, but more recently we did another one with a much greater sample size and a slightly different question. The idea is this, that you can embody people as anybody with first-person perspective and real-time motion capture. In particular, you can embody people as Sigmund Freud. In this experiment, first of all, you're embodied as yourself. So the avatar on the left is a faithful reproduction of the actual person, and you talk to Dr. Freud. And then you swap bodies and you're in the body of Dr. Freud and you see and hear yourself explain the problem, and then you can respond. And then you go back in your own body and you hear what and see what Freud said, and you can keep having this conversation as long as you like. So here's a video of the latest version of this. So this is the scanning process. We scan people, it takes a couple of minutes, and then there's about half an hour processing after that to make a copy of the body. Here you see an example. The subject.
So what is the problem you'd like to talk about today?
My problem is that I like to take better care of my health. Usually I'm sitting for 8 hours in my job at work and I don't get any exercise, and I feel like I should maybe do something about that.
Okay.
So this is dealing with people's personal problems.
Please look down.
This is the embodiment process. So they
Raise
do this
your right hand.
once for each body.
Now look in the mirror to your left. When the light next to you turns green, explain the problem to the person in front of you.
So when I notice that I am delaying going to the gym after I come back from work, I think that I should go because I want to take care of my health.
Now listen to the person in front of you, and when the light next to you turns green, reply and try to help them find a solution.
So when I notice that I'm delaying going to the gym after I come back from work. Okay, so why do you think that you delay? Why do you think that you're not going? What seems to be the problem?
Why do you think that you delay? Why do you think that you're not going? What seems to be the problem? What seems to be stopping you?
So there was a control condition here where they didn't swap bodies, but they just talked to a scripted version of Freud. And the reason we did this is because we know everyone improves simply by talking about their problem. We wanted to see if the embodiment itself would make a difference, if the changes in body would make a difference. Then 1 week later, they came back again and they talked to the clinical psychologist and answered some questionnaires and so on. So what happened in this experiment, there were 29 people in each group, the body swapping condition and the pre-programmed Freud condition. So they had a screening, then they had, they met before the VR, then after the VR, they were questionnaires, then after 1 week. The body ownership was high in both their own scanned body and Freud. There were no differences, is what I said before. This body ownership doesn't depend on the type of body. I mean, it has to be a human body, but it doesn't have to look like you. This works irrespective of the kind of body that you have. So what did we find? We found that in the experimental condition, the pink bars, people got better knowledge of their problem, better understanding. They had new ideas about it, better control over it. Perspective only applied to the experimental group, and it helped them. And then this was, I think, the most telling result, that this is the proportion of people who report change. So prior to VR, of course, it's more or less the same in both groups. It's just different due to chance, slightly different due to chance. After VR, immediately after VR, there's a big difference between the experimental group and the control group, and that's maintained for 1 week, at least 1 week. We don't know any further than that. You don't have to use this for personal problems. I used it myself.
Please look down towards your body.
To decide what to talk
Look
about.
at your
and
right
come and
hand.
talk. But I spoke to Steve Jobs.
Look at your left hand.
This is the embodiment period.
Now look in the mirror to your left. Raise your right arm. Raise your left arm. You can now put your arms down. When the light next to you turns,
Then embodied as Steve
you can
Jobs.
now put your arms down. Listen to the person in front of you. And when
I'm giving a talk this week where I'm supposed to describe our work, but there's just so much to talk about. I don't know on what to focus.
Well, what is it that interests you? What is it that you're most excited about? Why do you use virtual reality at all?
Well, I use virtual reality because you can achieve things in virtual reality that you can't do in reality, which nevertheless can be very beneficial. But there's so many things we do like that. I'm not sure on what to focus.
yourself.
Well, which is the one that inspires you the most?
The one I like best is the one where you're talking to another person, like, for example, you, and then you swap bodies to share ideas, and somehow you reach conclusions that you may not have reached in another way.
Well, that's a great idea. Why don't you just show this then?
Very good. I think that's exactly what I'll do. Thank you very much. Bye.
We had a visit from Joshua Rothman, who's a journalist with the New Yorker, and he did it. And what he wrote was really interesting. He said, soon I fell into a rhythm. Freud and I talked for about 20 minutes. He was insightful. He said things I'd never said to myself in ordinary life. When I took off my headset, I was moved. I wanted to tell myself, good talk. From his perspective, I'd seem different, sadder, more ordinary and comprehensible. I told myself to remember that version of me. By the way, why Freud? It wouldn't have been my choice. But before we did the experiment, we did a survey amongst the population who would be potential participants. And we asked them, who would you like to talk to about who would you like to talk about a personal problem with? And number 2 came Angelina Jolie, and number 1 came Freud. So that's what we chose. In our current work, this is work that started a few months ago. We're actually reconstructing rock concerts from the early 1980s. This is partly technical, or a lot of technical research, but the goal is to make it a platform for the study of presence in past events, music and auditory effects, large-scale events, navigation through large spaces, and most importantly, re-immersing older people in their past. And we have some big plans to work in that area. So basically what we're doing is we're taking these old videos, DVDs and so on, and we're trying to reconstruct the performers. We'll be building models of the auditorium and this kind of thing. And then we're going to take people who had attended those kind of concerts and look at some various factors about how it affects them. So what makes us who we are? Because virtual reality, as was raised in the first talk, it raises these really interesting questions. Is who we are our body? No, maybe not, because the brain seems remarkably plastic in accepting radical changes. Is it our attitudes, our actions, our cognition, intentions? These seem to be also changeable using these techniques. And by the way, we should remember that there's strong ethical considerations in all this, because this kind of technology can be used for good or evil. So I think in the coming years, we'll see applications of these techniques to self-transformation, including, most importantly, I think, medical and psychological. And we should remember that virtual reality isn't simply for reproducing reality. We can have impossible beneficial experiences. So as an example, when I feel lonely and uninspired, I can experience this.
I've paid my dues. Time after time, I've done my sentence, but committed no crime. And bad mistakes, I've made a few. I've had my share of sand kicked in my face, but I've come through. And I need to go on, 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 on. We are the champions, my friend.
So I'd like to acknowledge our funders, which mainly our work is funded by European Union projects, European Research Council, the one on sexual harassment by the Office of Naval Research. And of course, there's many people involved in this research. I don't know why this one keeps disappearing. So thank you very much. I don't know even if anybody heard what I said, but I finished talking.